Hi, this is Brian Perry, Perry Home Solutions, coming to you with an Inside Real Estate video. We want to answer questions that we get asked all the time and really shine a light on challenges that people have in different areas of real estate and things that are really confusing to a lot of people. So the first thing that I'm getting a lot of questions about that I want to talk about right now are appraisals. And so I have some of my teammates here and they have a bunch of questions for me that they're going to lob at me, and hopefully I'll be able to answer them all and people will have a better understanding of appraisals in general. So,
first question, Brian, what's an appraisal versus an inspection?
So an appraisal versus an inspection. So a lot of people get those two things confused because oh, sorry, this is distracting. People get appraisals versus inspections confused because many people think they're the same thing and they're kind of different. It's very common for a buyer to inspect a home when they purchase it. Usually there's an inspection period in the contract, and that's a separate thing. And then there's usually a separate appraisal. So usually, sometimes we conflate those two, but they're actually different things. And what an appraisal is it's an expert that comes out to evaluate the value of a home. An inspector is coming out to evaluate the condition of the home. Now, the appraiser will pay some attention to the condition, but they're not going to do an in-depth inspection like an inspector would. An appraisal is usually in a house for maybe 20 minutes or something. An inspector is usually there for a couple of hours. So there are big differences from that perspective.
Okay, Brian, what is the purpose of an appraisal? Why is that appraisal done?
Well, there's a few reasons why people have appraisals done. I mean, the ultimate purpose is to evaluate the value of the property. But 90% of the time when appraisals are done, it's because a bank requires it. So a buyer's purchasing a home, they're getting a mortgage, and the mortgage company requires an appraisal so they can feel comfortable about the value and determine how they're going to lend the money based on that. So it's primarily for loans.
How much does it cost to have an appraisal done?
Appraisals usually range from, I want to say, about $300 to $600 in that range roughly.
Do I have to have an appraisal if I'm paying cash?
No, you don't. And as a matter of fact, interestingly enough, one of the major reasons why sellers feel that cash is a valuable offer is because there's no appraisal usually. So, so that is generally the value of a cash offer is you're not asking for an appraisal. You're saying I'm willing to pay this amount of money and there's no contingency. In that case, that would be an appraisal contingency. Now, that all being said, you absolutely can add an appraisal contingency to a cash offer. That's completely permissible. Whether or not you want to do that from a negotiating strategy, that's a whole other topic that we'll have to discuss. So,
how do I get the results of an appraisal?
That's a little complex. If you, in your last question, if you have a cash offer and you want to add an appraisal contingency, you're just paying for the appraisal, you're hiring your own appraiser, so the appraiser is going to send you the results directly. That's not usually what happens, though. Usually appraisals happen in reference to getting a mortgage. And so, even though you as the buyer pay for the appraisal, the bank is the one that orders it and controls it. So the results of the appraisal go to the bank. And generally, before they'll even release the results of the appraisal, it goes through their review process as well. So ultimately, the answer to your question is how you get the results of an appraisal. How do you get the results of an appraisal? The bank gives it to you. Now, if you're the buyer, that's the case. If you're the seller, the appraisal is a very important consideration as a seller because oftentimes the contract is contingent upon that appraisal. And unfortunately, you're not necessarily entitled to see the results. So that's where the topic of appraisal becomes a little contentious with sellers because they want to know when the appraisal is completed, when the appraisal results are in, so they know they feel a little more secure about moving forward in their plans. And unfortunately, there's no real requirement for the buyer to share that unless there's a problem.
That leads me to a really good question. If I don't like the appraisal amount, can I get another appraisal done?
That's a really good question. Well, that exceeds the scope of me as a real estate salesperson a little bit, because that would be the policy of the lender that you're working with. Again, most of the time that you have an appraisal done, it's because you're getting a mortgage and it's required by the lender, so the lender governs that process. I would say usually the answer to that question would be no, you can't, because you can't. One of the premise of an appraisal is it's randomized. So most banks go to an appraisal company, and that appraisal company has a pool of appraisers that they randomly select from. And they do that so they can show that it's done at arm's length and they're not influencing it. So it's supposed to be uninfluenced and clean and pure and whatever. So no, just because you don't like it, usually you can't get a change. However, what we do on many occasions is if appraisal comes back and it seems to be very erroneous, if it just has all kinds of missing information, or we just think that value is way off based on what we're seeing, you can dispute an appraisal in some instances, if it's worth it, if it really is disputable. And in that case, you might be able to get the appraisal changed if, in fact, the appraiser actually missed crucial elements that can help him or her determine the value of the property. So, I don't know if that answers the question, but that's the best I can give you.
Okay, Brian. So once the appraisal is done and all of this has been completed and approved, can I start packing? Am I pretty safe to go to closing?
Yeah, for the most part. I mean, there's a couple of major hurdles in the contract process, generally speaking. Every contract's a little bit different, so you have to be careful about this. The first stage is the inspection, as we discussed earlier. That's a pretty big one. There's a fall-through rate during the inspection. The next stage is the appraisal. That's also pretty big, because if the appraisal does not meet the contract price, that could be a problem, and that may affect the sale of the property. So at that point, that's a big hurdle. After that, it tends to be relatively smooth sailing, but the way that we structure contracts is we'll put in a deadline that they have to not conduct the appraisal by, but actually deliver us a loan commitment by, and that's a whole other topic. So that's also sort of a drop dead date where you can kind of base your plans on, and that would be maybe a topic for another video or something. But yeah, but short version is after the appraisal, yeah, it is much more secure than prior to that, certainly.
Have you ever had any instances where you were told the appraisal was good and then it turned out that it wasn't?
Yeah, I have. So not that long ago, as a matter of fact, it's happened on rare occasion. We had a 30-day closing on a property, and I believe it was 1 or 2 days prior to closing, we get a call from the lender, and the lender said the appraisal had originally come back fine, and we knew that. However, a day before closing, the lender called us back and said that the underwriter at the lender, at the mortgage company, decided that it was incorrect and changed it arbitrarily and reduced it by $30,000 the day before closing. So many people are shocked by that. Most people don't realize that can happen, but the appraisal is still governed by the bank. The bank makes the decision there. It's not the buyer's decision, it's not the seller's decision, it's not the real estate agent's decision, it is the bank's decision. And they decided to change it, good, bad, or indifferent. So we had to deal with that, and ultimately we worked it out, and we still got the property closed on time, but that was certainly riddled with turmoil. A lot of people are confused about how appraisals work, and that was very eye-opening to many. So, good question. So I think that's everything that we have about appraisals. If anybody has any questions about appraisals, please give us a call, 561-880-5696, and we will be back to you soon with our next Inside Real Estate video. Stay happy from Perry Home Solutions.